This lecture is going to get you through the plants chapter. As always, remember, if I go too fast, you can pause it so that you can record whatever you want to. I tried to make the PowerPoint a little bit more complete this time so that you can make sure you get everything you need by looking at the slides. So to start you out, you have what are the characteristics that define a plant. So all plants are eukaryotic. Remember, that means they have cells that have a nucleus and other organelles like roughy R, smoothie R. Most plant cells, well, not most, a lot of plant cells are going to have chloroplasts, but it kind of depends on which organ in a plant you're looking at. Plants are all going to be multicellular. Most of them are going to be photosynthetic and be able to make their own food. There are some exceptions to that rule. There are some plants that are parasitic, in fact, and steal nutrients from other plants. Plants are going to have true tissues, like they have vascular tissue, they have ground tissue, they have dermal tissue, they have different kinds of cells that make up each of those types of tissues. And plants do have organs like you do. You have a liver and a stomach, they have roots, stems, and leaves. This happens to be one of my favorite plants in the world, even though it is not in the state of Texas. It is an oak tree that's called angel oak, and it's in South Carolina. It's a very, very old oak tree, and it just looks so wonderful and gnarly, and it's just one of my favorite plants. It casts some good shade too, which as a super pale person, I always like shade when I'm in a hot southern state. Next, you have what are the four main groups of plants. First group is going to be non-vascular plants. They're called non-vascular because they don't have vascular tissue, which we're going to talk about that later on. That means xylem and phloem. That means these plants are going to tend to have to stay small because they can't move nutrients and water through the plant very well. And they're all going to have to stay close to water since they can't move stuff around in their body very well. Next up, you have seedless vascular plants. So we pick up vascular tissue, but these plants don't make seeds. The classic example of that is the fern, which you can buy that as a house plant. You have probably seen a fern at some point. They don't make seeds, flowers, or fruits, but they do have vascular tissue to help them move water and nutrients and things around through their leaves. Because they have that vascular tissue, these can get to be larger. They do tend to still need to stay next to water, especially for reproductive purposes, but they can grow on land. Next major group of plants is Gymnosperms. This would be like pine trees and bald cypresses and cedar trees, and if you don't know any of those, think Christmas tree. A lot of the things in the Gymnosperm group make cones. Not all of them do, but they're showing you one that happens to produce cones. These guys do make seeds, they do have vascular tissue, but they don't flower and they don't fruit yet. And then your last group is the flowering plants. They're called Angiosperms. They do have vascular tissue, they do make seeds, they do produce flowers. They don't have to be showy flowers, but they have to make flowers as reproductive structures. And then the flower becomes the fruit after fertilization has occurred. Next, how do plants get the things that they need in order to survive? So since plants are autotrophic, that means they're going to be photosynthetic. So they need to have light and they need to have carbon dioxide in order to carry out photosynthesis. The light is generally going to be coming from sunlight. However, you can use grow lights. Even household lighting is good for some plants to grow in, and so it doesn't have to come from the sun. Carbon dioxide is just going to be in the atmosphere floating around. They're going to breathe that in, sort of like you guys breathe in oxygen. They breathe in carbon dioxide through stomata, which we're going to talk about here in just a little bit. How do plants get water and minerals? Both of these two things are going to be absorbed from the soil, so the roots are going to help out with this. There's specialized little structures that are called root hairs within the roots that help to absorb water, and then minerals like calcium and nitrogen and things like that that are in the soil that the plants are going to need. Next up, one of the problems with plants moving up onto land is that water might not have been as readily available as it had been when they lived in water before that point. And so plants are constantly having to battle drying out, especially here in our part of Texas. One of the things that plants can use to help them prevent that water loss is something called a cuticle. It's a waxy layer that's on the surface of the leaf, and it's kind of like having your oil layer on top of you. It helps to prevent a lot of drying out. And so it's doing that for plants as well. If you were to go outside and look at some native Texas plants, especially the cactuses, they have a nice thick cuticle that helps them prevent that water loss. Stomata, plants have these usually on the underside of a leaf. They're sort of like little mouths. When they're open, the plants can breathe in carbon dioxide and lose oxygen through the stomata. However, they can also close their mouth if they start to get dehydrated to prevent excess water loss. The problem is when they do that, they can't breathe when they close their mouth. And so some plants have to have some modifications to help them be able to do both photosynthesis and close their stomata at the same time. I mentioned earlier that plants have specific types of vascular tissue, or tissue in general. Vascular tissue is one of the examples that I gave you. Vascular tissue in you is like arteries and veins. It moves stuff around inside of your body. Well, plants have that too. We just don't call them arteries and veins. Instead, it's called xylem and phloem. I kind of want you to think of a plant like it's got a northbound highway that takes things from the roots to the leaves, and there's a southbound highway that's taking things from the leaves to the roots. So you have arteries and veins, they've got xylem and phloem. Xylem is going to be your northbound side, where we're picking water up from the roots, taking it up through the stem, and then taking it to the leaves so that the plants can use that water doing whatever the leaves want them to do. Phloem, on the other hand, goes in the opposite direction. This is our southbound lanes of the highway, so it takes the food that was produced during photosynthesis from the leaves down through the stem and then down to the roots. Now, you guys are non-majors, you don't have to know this, but whenever you look at a leaf under a microscope, especially monocots, they end up with these structures that in undergrad we always called monkey faces. This one's mouth is not super well developed, but the two eyes that you can see in the monkey face, that's xylem. And so this is some of their vascular tissue that would be taking water up from the roots to the leaves. The phloem is like the forehead up here, and so this is the part that's going to be taking the food down to the roots from the leaves. Next up, lignin. So there's two major types of plants, herbaceous and woody. Herbaceous plants are like this plant, and I never knew the name of it, but it had this like weird fluffy, I don't know, like test tube cleaner, flowery sort of thing off over here. But that plant's not woody, it's herbaceous. It doesn't stand up super duper well. These robins, they had trampled the plants all, well, the plant wasn't doing well, I'll just suffice to say that. And so this is an herbaceous plant. This, on the other hand, it happens to be a hackberry or a sugarberry, whichever one you want to call it. It's a woody plant. So these birds would not have been able to do damage to this plant because woody plants have wood in them. That wood makes them stronger. Lignin is a component that plants put in their cell wall if they're woody plants. And so this plant would have lignin in addition to cellulose in their cell walls. This plant doesn't get that same amount of lignin, if any at all, and so that's what makes it an herbaceous plant. So lignin is what makes wood woody. Next up, you have describe alternation of generations, including the sporophyte and gametophyte generations in your answer. So you guys are labeling what's on here. You're labeling the gametophyte. So gametophyte is called that. So phyte means plant, gameto means gamete. So this is the plant that makes the gametes. Now, to contrast this to you, when you make your gametes, you use meiosis to reduce the number of chromosomes so that you can make your sperm and egg. The issue is, though, the gametophyte plant is already haploid, so they already only have one set of chromosomes in the cells of the gametophyte. So they don't need to do meiosis to make their sperm and egg. Instead, they're going to do mitosis and just make more of those cells. So their sperm and egg are still haploid, but we did mitosis to make them instead of meiosis. After fertilization, where sperm gets into egg, we have the zygote, which is going to be the very first cell in the sporophyte generation. Now again, if you break this word down, this means it's the plant that makes the spores. It does that, so notice that it is a diploid cell. It does have two sets of chromosomes inside of it, the set from the sperm and the set from the eggs. Spores are going to be haploid cells too, so the sporophyte plant is what uses meiosis to reduce the number of chromosomes to make the spores, which are haploid. So they do mitosis and meiosis at different points in their life cycle from where you do mitosis and meiosis. They do also still do mitosis for growth and repair. They just also do it to make their gametes, their sperm and the eggs. The spores are where they do meiosis to make those. Next up, you have pollen. One of the things that's always kind of fun, unless you're a volunteer firefighter or a paid firefighter for that matter, in Texas, is people will call the fire department thinking trees are on fire because cedar trees in our area make so much pollen, it looks like smoke that's coming out of them. And I actually have a little video to show you what I'm talking about. So yeah, all of this, what looks like smoke, that's just pollen from those cedar trees. And so people that aren't used to Texas and how it works, they'll think, oh crap, there's a fire over there, I better do something about it. And so then the volunteer fire department gets a call and they come out here and then they have to explain to the vacationer or the homeowner, no, that's just a bunch of pollen that a lot of people happen to be allergic to. Cedar trees are very prolific pollinators. So if you happen to be allergic to cedar trees and you happen to see this, don't go outside in that, because it will make you a very unhappy person if you are there when it's doing its thing. So that's the pollen thing. So next up about the pollen. The pollen is the part of the plant that actually contains the sperm, that male gamete that's in a plant. It also happens to fossilize very well. And so these are just some pictures of different types of pollen produced by different plants. We can look in fossil record layers to see what kinds of pollen were growing or being produced, so that we could see what kind of plants were growing in that area at different times in evolutionary history. Pollination is the act of getting pollen from the male part of a flower that makes it to the female part of the flower that's going to contain the ovary. So remember, the carpel is the part of a flower that has a stigma, a style, and then there would have been an ovary. This picture just didn't include that. The stigma is very often sticky, so that pollen will stick to the stigma. And once the pollen of that same species of flower sticks to the stigma, it starts to drill a hole through here, and that hole ends up being called the pollen tube. Sperm traveled down that tube to eventually get to the eggs, but that comes later. So I need you to understand that pollination is not the same thing as fertilization. Pollination has to happen first. Fertilization can take 2 years after this point in some plants, or it can just take a couple weeks. It depends on which kind of plant, how long that takes. Pollination is something that is in the news a fair amount recently, because butterfly species are reducing in numbers due to some of the herbicides that we use, killing off some of the other plants that they have to feed on. And then bee colonies are collapsing for a number of different reasons. And those are some of our major pollinators. And if we lose those, all of those flowers that they help to pollinate can't reproduce anymore. And a lot of those flowers that they're pollinating are very important for us. Things like almond, that produces almond milk and almond butter and just almonds, the almonds. They help make things like peaches. I mean, they're making a lot of the food that you eat. And so we have to be careful with any of the chemicals that we spray in the environment, because if we hurt the pollinators, we end up hurting ourselves, because we won't have as much food for us to eat. Seed is essentially just a little baby plant that's curled up and protected in very often a very firm seed coat to protect that baby plant that's growing inside of there. There's usually a layer also in there that's called an endosperm, which is a bunch of starch stored for the baby so that it can grow before it becomes photosynthetic once it breaches the soil. So this is a pine seed. This is an acorn, which the seed of an oak tree is in there. And then this is a pecan, which squirrels are really good at planting for you. Flowers. Only the angiosperms have flowers. So the non-vascular plants, the seedless vascular plants, and the gymnosperms, they don't do this. Only the angiosperms do. The flowers have a couple of parts that are going to matter for us. We're going to have a bunch of stamens in the case of this strawberry flower off over here. They produce the pollen, which again contains the sperm. We have lots of carpels that are in the middle of this thing right here. They can, and in a lot of cases, self-pollinate, so the pollen from this can come in here, and then once we have pollinated, after fertilization occurs, we will turn that into a flower. You can see the sepals, those green leafy things that are on the flower back here. Those leaves that you have on a strawberry that you usually pick off before you eat, those are the sepals from the flower. And so this yellow part right here is what becomes the actual strawberry with the seeds all on the outside. This is a plant that is very common in our area, and in fact I just saw my first batch as I was on a walk yesterday. This is called a primrose, or a showy primrose. People tend to not notice them because they're so very prevalent around here, but if you actually get up close, they're gorgeous little flowers. This right here is the stigma, which leads to the style. The ovary is actually under this flower. You can't see it. This is an anther. The filament is what supports that, and the whole entire structure is called a stamen. You can't see the sepals on this, but you can tell that each flower has 4 petals in the case of the primrose. This is another one. Usually in class I ask people, what do you think this is? And so I'll pause and y'all can throw out answers verbally in your nice little wherever you're taking your classes at this point. You can see the stamens, the stigma, the style. You can even see the ovary in this case because the ovary is above the rest of the flower. The petals are fused together over most of their length. When this ends up producing a fruit, the fruit's going to have about this same shape, but there's going to be a membrane over the top right here. What would you think it might be? I don't know. Nobody ever gets it. But if any of you said blueberry, yay, you are correct. That is what a blueberry flower looks like prior to making the fruit. This is another one that's edible. This happens to be planted in my front yard right now. Use these to help you. These are unopened flowers. They look a lot like what the fruit will look like later on, although it's going to get much bigger. You can see lots of stamens making lots of pollen off inside of there. This is a thorny plant. You can see one of the thorns up there. You could count the number of petals if you really felt like it, but if I remember correctly, there are 5, because I'm not going to sit here and count them for you guys. Anybody want to take a guess as to what that one is? It's weird trying to do this over the internet like this, but this is what a pomegranate flower looks like. And you can again see this is kind of what the pomegranate skin looks like after the flower ends up being pollinated and then fertilized. You'll make the pomegranate with all the little arils inside of it. And yeah, they do grow fairly well around here unless we get a late freeze, and then they don't do as well that year. So the flower eventually leads to the fruit. The purpose of the fruit is the same as like college for us. We do not want our kids to live with us for the rest of our life. We want them to go away at some point, and the fruit does the same thing for a plant. It allows the babies to go away from the parent plant so that they're not competing for nutrients and things. Some fruits are carried by wind, some of them are carried by water. Sometimes an animal eats the fruit and then poops out seeds later on, but that's the whole point, is to get the seeds away from the parent plant. So strawberries, you eat the whole seeds, although people have been so bored during this epidemic that they have been picking the seeds off strawberries, which that tells you how bored some people are. What I usually mention at this point is I want you guys to eat things that you're not used to eating. Like everybody in our area is used to like strawberries, blueberries, apples, oranges, and bananas, and they very often don't go outside of that comfort zone. So again, anybody kind of know what this is? It's got a really easy name. It's a star fruit. I had the best ones of my life when I was in Hawaii. It's really hard to find good ones here in Texas because they don't ship super duper well. I kind of thought they tasted like a cross between an apple and a kiwi. They are yummy. If you find some that are still nice and firm, then buy them and give them a try because they really are very yummy. This is another one you can find in our area sometimes. It's called a horned melon. It is kind of like a cross, in my opinion, between an orange and a kiwi. I don't know why kiwi comes up so often, but it's got an interesting little flavor and sort of an orangey little texture to it. You don't eat the rind of this one, so that's a horned melon. This one is considered by most to be the stinkiest food in the world. It is what's known as a durian fruit. I don't have a link to this, so I'm going to come out here just to show you guys a video of some people reacting to a durian fruit. I have never found one in the United States for sale. I don't know why it is that I like Irish people eating things, but I like Irish people eating things. So let's watch these guys.
What in the fuck is that?
Okay, sorry, bad words.
The smelliest fruit in the bloody world right bloody now.
Oh my god.
Oh fuck, don't get that done! Ah! So the challenge is we have a candy G-string here. It's edible underwear. Joey, are we gonna do it?
Oh, we're going
Right.
now, yeah.
How's she gotten? Leather jacket guy. With an Irish man.
That's me.
And an Irish woman. Who claimed that sleeping on your belly button bends your bloody willy. It's jolly bullshit, leave.
Okay, they already reacted to the durian fruit, so I'll stop that. Yeah, sorry, they make me laugh. I don't know what it is about Leather Jacket Guy, I just love him. But yeah, durian fruits really smell very unpleasant. The best way that I've ever heard it described, the most descriptive way I've ever heard it described, is imagine that some really hairy, sweaty dude left his gym socks plus a hunk of cheddar cheese in his gym bag and then forgot about it for a month. And then you found that bag after a month, and the smell of sweaty, nasty, oily socks plus moldy, funky cheese is what a durian fruit supposedly smells like. I have never smelled one because, again, I've never found one for sale in the United States. People say it tastes good if you can get the smell kind of out of your mind, but most people can't do that. Next up, you have this table. The table has our 4 different groups of plants that we had already talked about before. So the first group is your avascular or non-vascular plants. So this group does not make seeds. They don't have xylem and phloem. Because of that, again, they can't move material up and down through the plant, so the plant tends to be really small. Their sperm have flagella like ours do, which means their reproduction is tied to water. So again, you're only going to find them in watery places. So rivers and streams that don't dry up in our area. When it's really rainy outside, you can find some growing next to foundations and things, but in the summertime they go away. So all this green stuff on the surface of these rocks, that's all moss, which is an example of a bryophyte that's growing through there. This is the miscellaneous stuff that you needed to get for that. I'll just remember, pause your video so you can write that stuff down. Okay, seedless vascular plants. I mentioned ferns earlier. This is your classic example of a seedless vascular plant. One of the other examples of this that we have here in Texas is a horsetail. It's in the genus Equisetum. You get that in lab as well. But you find this in rivers in our area. You can find ferns too, but they tend to be smaller than this in our area. Sperm are still flagellated, so they have to stay next to water for reproduction, but because they have vascular tissue, they can grow a portion of their life away from water, and again, they can get to be fairly tall. I think in the lab video I already mentioned that horsetails are also known as scouring rushes because they have silica in their bodies, and so that silica is basically like sand, and so you can scrub pots and stuff if you're camping out in the wild. People use them to scour their pots and pans. Gymnosperms. So this is a sequoia tree from California. I was trying to get a picture from the bottom looking up so you could kind of get a sheer scale of the size. Like think of if you've only lived in Texas your whole life, think of the biggest tree you've ever seen and then multiply that by like 10, and that's how big these trees are. They're gigantic and they're gorgeous, and the forests under them are cool and humid and wonderful. So we do have vascular tissue. They can get to be really tall. They do produce seeds. Some of them produce them in cones. Some of them don't have cones. They do not have fruits, however. Only the conifers, which is a subgroup of gymnosperms, have things like pine cones. This is also our first group where the sperm aren't flagellated, so even their reproduction isn't tied to water, so they can get into some very dry places and live their lives in those places. I mentioned earlier Christmas trees are in this group. If you've ever heard of ginkgo or taken ginkgo as a memory supplement, ginkgo trees are also in the gymnosperm group. After that, you have angiosperms. So this is our flowering plant group that also makes the fruits. They do have seeds that are in or on the fruit. They have vascular tissue, so they can get to be fairly large. And once again, reproduction not tied to water because the sperm don't have flagella. This plant, it's sometimes called a fuchsia. It is sometimes called a bleeding heart. Usually these are white, but in this case, and I was in California when I took this picture on the crookedest street in the United States, which is Lombard Street in San Francisco. But this fuchsia, I just took a picture of it because I hadn't seen one with the pink petals inside of here like this before. It's another one of those just lovely plants that you can find there. Grasses are angiosperms too. They do flower, it's just that their flowers are very drab and boring, and so most people don't bother to think of them as flowers, but they are. Any plant material that you eat, generally speaking, is going to be from the angiosperm group. Like if you think about what you had for breakfast, if you had strawberries or bananas, if you had orange juice, all of those are angiosperms. If you had an unhealthier breakfast of like a Pop-Tart, the wheat that was in there is an angiosperm. The cinnamon in a brown sugar cinnamon Pop-Tart, the cinnamon comes from a flowering plant. Rice, potatoes, carrots, any of those fruits that I showed you earlier, they're all from this group. And so most of the plant material that you eat comes from the angiosperm group. Very small little sentence underneath the table, you have how do animals participate in angiosperm reproduction. So I'd already talked about pollination. They help out with that. That's still true, but I put it up there. Second thing is, animals in a lot of cases help to disperse the fruit, taking the fruit away from the parent plant. So I'm going to give you a few different examples of that. We do have cockleburs in Texas, but not in urban areas. But cockleburs get stuck to like horses' tails or long hair in a dog. And then the animal will walk around for a while until it either falls out or the animal chews it out and spits it up. And so it can carry that around for a long time before it bothers to chew it off or it falls off. This plant is sometimes called a devil's claw. It can actually inflict a lot of harm on livestock. These little spurs are very, very sharp, and what they can do is wrap around the leg of an animal like a goat or a horse that's walking around, and then it will pierce their foot and make a wound get started so that the animal starts to bleed. It stays hooked onto that leg for quite a while, and it can cause an infection. So it's a nuisance plant that is out there, but the seeds would be coming out of this structure. So as the animal was walking around with this stuck to their leg, they would be dispersing the seeds that had been stuck in that fruit. things like horse apples or bodarks or little berries, animals eat those and then poop out little pre-fertilized packets of seeds so that the seeds have all the nitrogen and phosphorus they're going to need as they grow. This is for the pollination aspect. Generally speaking, if you have a flower that is brightly colored but doesn't really have a smell, birds are going to pollinate that. Specifically, hummingbirds are a really good one. If you have something that smells really good, that's usually going to be bees or butterflies. If you have a plant that smells funky, that's usually going to be a beetle. And then if it has a flower that opens at night, bats are really good pollinators for things that open at night. So there's a bunch of different ways that animals can help plants disperse their seeds or disperse their pollen. All right. So usually what I do at this point is we design a potluck, and we can't exactly do that with the way courses are having to go at this point. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you two options. I'm going to post a coloring quiz into Blackboard where you will color the parts of a flower. Remember, we talk about this in lab, so you can get all your flower anatomy there. So you can turn in that coloring quiz to me. Or you can try to have a little bit more fun with this and essentially make like a spoof cooking video where you cook some sort of a dish that has some sort of a plant that is in it. Like right now, I have a pot roast going in a slow cooker, and in that pot roast, I've got onion, which is a plant. I've got potato, which is a plant. I've got carrots, which is a plant. I've got garlic, which is a plant. I've got thyme, and I've got rosemary. You only have to pick one plant thing, but you can do what I'm saying in here for this in-class presentation that's at the bottom of the plants note, and you can just make a video where you tell us a little bit about a plant that is in a dish that you're making, and then just sort of make that little spoof cooking video, sort of like Julia Child or Rachel Ray or whatever. Here's another option. This one was because I had made this when I made this presentation. This was a cheesecake brownie. The brownie has cocoa in it, that comes from a plant. It's got wheat in it, that comes from a plant. It's got sugar in it, that comes from a plant. So have some fun. Make some dish that you like. You're trapped at home. It's not like you can go do anything else. So you get the choice of making me a fun little video talking about a plant and a recipe and giving me the information that's in the plant's note. Or you can lame out and just do the coloring quiz that I'm going to post for you guys in Blackboard. Your choice.